in this
The
episode.
thought in that paper was to kind of like raise up the question, which is not a question that is it's new. Other people like Tim van Helder, who is very well known for his work in dynamical systems, as rose the same kind of question, which is what is the requirement of borrowing certain concepts from the toolkit of these other more computationalist views, such as the view that is developed within modularity of the mind, such as notions like representation, for example. What purpose, Tim van Helder asked, and we also ask in this paper, what purpose does really the notion of representation is going to serve, if any, in that framework to understand the mind? So we follow that and get inspiration on that a little bit. We are on board with that question. Really do not see a reason to keep that cognitivist view, to think about these network systems that would require an explanation that includes the notion of representation. So that's kind of like where we are in the paper. And then as we think about and we are inspired by these questions, right, then we need to think about the ways in which we develop machine learning systems, right? So the question then became, if we are training machine learning systems to do tasks such as perception, then perhaps a better way of thinking about perception would be rather than taking perception as the old school computationalist view takes it, as a recognition of inputs and outputs, very computational in character, then perhaps we should take perception as the phenomenon of perception, right? And by phenomenon of perception here, I mean going to the phenomenology of perception and taking perception as a phenomenon that is characterized with all of those phenomenal aspects to it, rather than a computational process of a recognition of inputs and outputs with some form of computational information processing.
Hey everyone, welcome to this conversation with Dr. Inês Hipólito, a philosopher of AI working through the tradition of E-cognition and Phenomenology. It was a riveting and soul-edifying dialogue. I had the opportunity to go to Macquarie University in Sydney and visit the philosophy department, which is a beautiful building, and just speak to some of the people there, but also have this amazing conversation with Dr. Hipólito. We discussed a variety of things, all the way from the free energy principle to the philosophy of AI, to deep learning, to Simone de Beauvoir and Wittgenstein, and of course, perhaps Dr. Hipólito's favorite, Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Before we get started though, a bit of a housekeeping note on a technicality. Unfortunately, when we were having the podcast, my microphone, it caused a bit of flux in the audio, and it can be a bit unpleasant to listen to. Although it's completely fine in the sense that you could understand what I'm saying, it is still audible, but it can be a bit unpleasant. And I hate to do this, I really do hate to do this, but I think it's still better if you watch this episode over listen to it, because I'm going to put an overlay text of the questions that I ask Inês, if I may, and then you'll have a bit more context as to what she's saying and what she's responding to. Now, I do hate to do this because I know most of the people are listeners to this podcast, but unfortunately, I tried my best to rectify this issue to the editors, and I think I've done my best with what I could, but perhaps for a better listening, or in this case, a better watching experience, I do recommend watching the episode on YouTube over listening to it on Spotify or Apple Podcast, whatever the case may be. But I sure am glad that Inês's mic is completely fine and everything she says is totally audible. But unfortunately, the questions might not be too clear. And of course, before we get started, a bit of a formal introduction to Dr. Hipólito. Dr. Inês Hipólito is an assistant professor at Macquarie University, specializing in cognitive science and philosophy of mind and AI. Prior to this role, she served as a lecturer at the Berlin School of Mind and Brain. She employs cognitive science, complex systems, and the free energy principle to investigate the dynamic relationship between human cognition and artificial intelligence. Furthermore, Dr. Hipólito is also the co-founder of the International Society of the Philosophy of the Sciences of the Mind and serves as the AI ethics advisor / architect for Versus, a cognitive computing company. Having said that, without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Inês Hipólito. So Inês, thank you for being here and thank you for your time.
My
I really do
pleasure.
appreciate it. Despite having a lot of AI researchers and philosophers of AI on the podcast, I haven't asked them this rather elementary question. Why is it that phenomenology, and let's say the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, for instance, a befitting discipline for AI research?
Yes, right. So that's quite a core question, and I'm glad that we're starting right there. Phenomenology is incredibly important for us to think about artificial intelligence in many ways, and in many ways, I think that we should bring it to the foreground if we really want to achieve anything close to artificial intelligence. So the reason that is so valuable is that may be, so its scope of study may be very well what is going to be the element that is going to differentiate, let's call it natural intelligence and artificial intelligence. While I can see that there can be some continuity between the two, done properly, one of the conditions for that to be done properly is actually phenomenology, if that makes sense. Because phenomenology is the study of perceptual experience, subjective experience in general, and is a whole very well established field that looks into the experience of being alive for individuals like us. And in that sense, it brings to the foreground that intelligence, cognition, our psychological experience is not quite reducible to computational processes. So then, in that sense, it's going to bring the whole experiential dimension, is going to bring the whole human natural experience that is so relevant and important to cognition or to psychology or to cognitive life and intelligence in general. So, in that sense, one could think that if we were to aim towards artificial intelligence through the very lenses of the very early beginnings of the goals of artificial intelligence, which is to create these systems that are somewhere, somehow close to being intelligent like us, then we need to pay attention to phenomenology.
Yes, well, it's quite interesting because, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but let's say in the kind of the history of 20th century philosophy, phenomenology really came from like the so-called continental philosophy or Europe, for instance, right? With thinkers like Heidegger, Edmund Husserl, and of course the person I believe your favorite, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and then Simone de Beauvoir. But my question would be: you have this, you laid down this critique in your paper, which is the one you published, an alternative cognitivism, computational phenomenology for deep learning. And in that paper, you kind of critique the current, let's call it the cognitivist or the computational theory of mind kind of framework of understanding human cognition. Um, so if you could lay down what that critique was, just for a general audience of cognitivism, but also then why do you propose computational phenomenology as an alternative framework for future AI research?
Yeah, so that's quite in the same line of what I was just saying. So the purpose in that paper is to begin from the understanding of phenomenology as an established field that is valuable to understand cognitive life in general, right? And when you depart from that perspective, you are departing from a very different perspective when you depart from the computational theory of mind. there's a whole history of computational theory of mind where we find a very rich literature, where you have different approaches, beginning with let's say, computationalist one, that starts with Jerry Fodor, the modularity of the mind, and then all of the revisions that approach has been receiving. And then you move on to parallel distributed processing, inspired kind of like theories of computational theory of mind, which is cognitivism or connectionism. And the thought in that paper was to kind of like raise up the question, which is not a question that is it's new. Other people like Tim van Helder, who is very well known for his work in dynamical systems, as rose the same kind of question, which is what is the requirement of borrowing certain concepts from the toolkit of these other more computationalist views, such as the view that is developed within modularity of the mind, such as notions like representation, for example. What purpose, Tim van Helder asks, and we also ask in this paper, what purpose does really the notion of representation is going to serve, if any, in that framework to understand the mind? So we follow that and get inspiration on that a little bit. We are on board with that question. We really do not see a reason to keep that cognitivist view, to think about these network systems that would require an explanation that includes the notion of representation. So that's kind of like where we are in the paper. And then as we think about and we are inspired by these questions, right, then we need to think about the ways in which we develop machine learning systems, right? So the question then became, if we are training machine learning systems to do tasks such as perception, then perhaps a better way of thinking about perception would be rather than taking perception as the old school computationalist view takes it, as a recognition of inputs and outputs, very computational in character, then perhaps we should take perception as the phenomenon of perception, right? And by phenomenon of perception here, I mean going to the phenomenology of perception and taking perception as a phenomenon that is characterized with all of those phenomenal aspects to it, rather than a computational process of a recognition of inputs and outputs with some form of computational information processing. Right. So once we did that exercise and we were like, okay, if we want the machine learning to behave like us, after all, that was the whole initial goal of artificial intelligence, was precisely, can we build systems that are similar to some kind to us? Then if we really are after building those systems that can perceive, recognize things in the world in ways that we do, then perhaps we should take one of the most established approaches and theories to understand precisely how we perceive the world, if that makes sense.
Totally. Well, this probably, is a good segue to a deeply philosophical question. Uh, from let's call it scientific realism. So, would a computational phenomenologist framework be a non-scientific realist framework? Would it view the world in terms of scientific realism? Oh, perhaps for the listeners, you could define what scientific realism is, and then try to how would a through this framework, through the computational phenomenology framework, how would you view scientific realism? Are you for it or are you against it? If I could put it in a crude way. Like that.
Yeah, so scientific realism is it's got an incredibly rich literature in philosophy of science. I find it extremely important for anyone that is a scientist to get educated on that and really take a stance and think about what their understanding of scientific practice is. Because however you answer or whatever you are going to situate yourself on that debate is going to be quite informing of the kind of like science that you practice. So scientific realism, to put it in a nutshell, which is probably not fair to the debate because it's extremely vast and rich. Yes, but to put it in a nutshell, you have on the one hand you have scientific realism. Let's put it like in one side of like the range, and then you have on the other side, let's call it instrumentalism. Then you have many different. You got many different approaches that are quite established and appealing and robust. So, but to talk about these two edges, you've got scientific realism, and it departs from somewhat Plato's philosophy, which is this view that there are certain ideals in the world, and the job of a scientist is to go out to the world and find those ideals. So science is a process of discovery of what is out there in the world, such that then what we would have is what our scientific practice is going to be, an output of it is going to be some kind of like model that somehow is going to be isomorphic to the thing in the world that has been discovered. So there's some form of isomorphism, and here there's a vast number of approaches that have been developed that really need to be really carefully understood, and I probably will not venture there right here because that would be another episode. So then you have on the other side, on the very other side, you have instrumentalism. And instrumentalism is slightly more of a constructivist approach. And in this constructivist approach, in its more radical form, of course, this is a range, more radical form, what you have is the view that there aren't really ideals, like Plato would have it, there aren't really ideals in the world. What there is these real world objects that exist, and then the scientific practice itself is going to be to begin with first looking at the world. And by looking at the natural world, we would see, because we are reasoning beings, we have the capacity to identify patterns in the behavior, how the natural world behaves and changes, etc. We are able to identify patterns. And the job of science is to make those patterns intelligible, such that if I would not engage and develop scientific experiments and critical thinking, we would not gain epistemic reach on those patterns. They would still exist, the objects and the behavior is still there. Those are real things that exist in the world. It's just that engaging in the scientific practice is kind of like allowing us to bring up this kind of like intelligibility, because we see those patterns, this intelligibility that we would not have if we were not engaging in scientific practice. So these are the two options. But then there's, of course, a whole range of very rich literature.
Indeed. So, but then from the two options, how would a computational phenomenologist, which side would they, let's say, side with or sway more towards?
Right. So then that would depend on what kind of like philosophy of mind you would bring in. Right. So the philosophy of science, scientific realism is not going to answer that question in itself, because then you have to also bring in a kind of like a philosophy of mind framework, right? So let's say that we were going to put aside the computational theory of mind.
Okay.
Right, so let's say that we put aside the computational theory of mind and we want to understand and develop artificial intelligent systems with computational phenomenology. right? So that's what we want to do. So that is, in my perspective, a very compelling project to pursue for several reasons stated before. One of the reasons is that if you do want to attain the early goal of artificial intelligence, which is that these systems are as close as possible to us, then computational phenomenology is the best bet. I'm not saying that it's going to be possible, but I'm saying that this is the one that I find that it's most appealing to get to that. Why? Well, because one very important aspect of our cognition and what is part of our defining us as human, natural, intelligent systems is that we have that the ways in which we interact with the world for a certain purpose that is can be described within the phenomenology of the ways in which we do things that are meaningful to us and how things in the environment become meaningful to us given our experience. So phenomenology is going to be very relevant to precisely get us anywhere close, if we even have a shot, to get like some artificial intelligence to be closer to our natural intelligence. So in that sense, the model. So now now that I've defined the philosophy of mind framework that I'm bringing in, now I'm going to move on to the philosophy of science framework that I think it's going to be the correct way of looking at the computational models that we develop. Um, I think that the computational models that we are going to develop, they are what they are. They are computational models, right? So what they are is they are these useful tools that are incredibly sophisticated, and they do not come out of nowhere. They are they emerge from incredibly sophisticated intelligence and resources that we have as a techno-scientific community been developing as part of the incredible capacity that human civilization has. So then these are tools that we develop. What I mean by this is that these computational models are things that exist in the world in a way that it's not independent from our own doings, our own practices that are incredibly highly situated in social cultural communities of epistemic communities, right? So these are our own doings. And I think that this is relevant because it's moving us away from scientific realism in the sense that I'm thinking about these computational models, for example, those that use machine learning, is tools that we develop, right? So in that sense, what we have is we have these computational models or even artificial intelligence systems that are a product of our technoscientific development. And those are tools. They're not much more than that. And then what we can do with them is we can ask them to do things for us. For example, we can develop a system that whose job is to recognize patterns, right? And these patterns can be like a task of image recognition, identifying, categorizing, all of those kinds of things that we can ask a machine learning system to do. But it can also be the case of these large language models, for example. What do? They do exactly that, the recognition of patterns. So exactly. So then what happens is that what you have is an explanation here that you hold, on the one hand, you are holding a quite clear philosophy of mind theory and framework, which is like, why am I holding this one and living and setting aside the other ones? Well, because I think that this one is the one that best describes our human way of perceiving the world, our human cognition, our psychological life, and the ways in which we are conscious beings navigating a complex world. That's why I'm holding this philosophy of mind framework and setting aside the computational theory of mind. So that's justified for me. And then I'm bringing in a philosophy of science framework that I think has got sufficient reasons that is going to be useful, because what I'm saying is that in our own doings, as we are epistemic communities and engaging in technoscientific practices, developing all of these AI systems, right? we develop these tools that are part of our practices. And those tools are going to allow us to do certain things in the world, right? But those are not more than tools. These are tools that are completely emerging from our socioculturally situated practices as techno-scientists.
Perfect, perfect. In fact, Ines, this perhaps lays the groundwork for a bit more of the technical questions, because one one thing you beautifully outlined in the paper was, firstly, you described what this representationalist framework, which I believe is inspired by cognitivism, is currently, it's through that framework a lot of contemporary AI researchers like work on their models, they build their tools. But then, of course, in the paper, what you propose is a non-representationalist framework. So, and that was for me a key takeaway from the paper. Could you firstly perhaps outline what the current contemporary representationalist framework is and how it's being used by AI researchers, and then what you propose in the paper, which is the non-representationalist framework, and hopefully for a layperson to understand how these two differ and give us different grounds to work off.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for asking me that. Yes. So basically, now we can that we have laid out like the kind of like theoretical frameworks that we're working with that allows us to go a little bit like more zooming in and focusing
Exactly.
on the representation bit and why I do not think that we need it. Right. So the point is, I don't think that we need it. I don't think it's necessary, and I think it causes more confusion beyond the fact that it's wrong. So why is it wrong? If one would look into defining what a representation is, I would agree with many scholars that defend that a representation requires many other things, but I'm just going to focus on one for the sake of time and making the point here. A representation requires a fully embodied, symbolically enculturated being to be able to make a representation, communicate it, and understanding it.
Yeah.
Right? So then the idea here is that a representation requires someone like us. So it requires that we not only have those capabilities, but that we've been enculturated and skilled into symbolic structures like numbers, languages, any kind of like symbolic thinking that allows us to understand that something represents something else. And that not only our understanding of that of something as representing something to us, as being meaningful to us in a certain way, but also communicating requires some kind of like symbolic structures that we need to engage with, like the language that I'm speaking right now. If we would not share a common language, I would not be able to communicate all of these ideas to you. So that's a requirement. So some part of in our developmental lives, we have been enculturated with a symbolic code that allows us to have this conversation right here, right now. Right, so when I think about representation, there is a set of criteria that needs to be there, and this has actually been very well outlined by and defined by Frankie Egan on the conditions for representation to be the case, right? But I'm going to focus on the one that is it requires symbolic enculturation, and that means it requires that we understand semantics, we understand meanings of things, right? So that being the case, note how it requires that human beings are situated in a social cultural environment and throughout life. It's not something that you just like are born with, but throughout time you develop and become ever more and more and more skilled, almost like riding a bike, in the sense that the more you ride the bike, the better and more skilled you become in riding a bike. So the enculturation with symbolic structures can be said to be quite similar in that sense. So then imagine this. I'm saying that it is possible for us to communicate because we share and exchange these forms of representations of how we understand concepts and the world, and we can use them properly. Now, why would we need to think about that's why I wanted to make the point that I just think including the notion of representation in networks of nodes that are computational processes it's just going to be unnecessary. It's just not necessary to have it there. Because there have been some arguments to say that, well, it's useful to have it there. I don't think it's useful to have it there, and I think it's wrong. So wrong, why? Because these systems have not been enculturated with engaging in the world and understanding semantics in the ways that we do, because these are computational systems, and I'm going to describe the kind of they are in a moment. But they're not that. They're not human beings like us that have gone through these really developmental enculturation that we have. So they do not understand semantics, right? So because of that, it would be wrong to say that node A represents what node B is saying. They'll be wrong. Some people have argued that it is useful nevertheless, right? I think it's not useful because we are anthropomorphizing a network, right? So that's not useful, and that's wrong, right? So I'm going to now give an example of what I mean in large language models, right? So that everybody's now
perfect example.
Exactly, because everybody now is acquainted with large language models like ChatGPT, and I want to talk about that. And this is perfect to give that the example of what I mean and the dangers of anthropomorphizing. Because it may be the case that until we had this new technology that is large language models, that we were just playing around with philosophy of mind and doing all of these things like anthropomorphizing these networks, these computational networks, and we would think like, oh, there's no danger in that. That's useful. And I'm going to tell you why it is dangerous, and how that becomes very clear in the light of large language models that we didn't have before, right? So large language model, the way that I see it, is a perfect illustration of John Searle's Chinese room, right? Why is that? Because it performs things. It looks like it's intelligent. It looks like it understands semantics. It gets the job done, right? In a way that looks like it's something intelligent and understands semantics, but it doesn't. Because what happens in large language models is that we have these incredibly sophisticated predictive models, right? And I'm working on a paper that hopefully is going to be out soon, where we talk about and we define and describe large language models as not being calculators for as being calculators for words. What does this mean? This means that there are real dangers when we interact with large language models, because one goes to interact with it thinking that when I'm interacting with a large language model, that it's going to give me something that is factual. And that's just not what is happening, right? So whatever it is that it is, the output, the content that is an output of a large language model is not a fact. But we take it as it being a knowledge fact, right? But it's not. What's happening is that we have these highly sophisticated predictive models that are going to predict tokens. So they're going to predict in the past, so until 2021, depending on which version we have, until 2021, these tokens have been the ones that have come together with these other tokens within this blanket of events or topic that we are talking about, right? So what they're going to do is going to tell us really how likely certain concepts and words and thoughts have been put together, right? So that's what it's going to give us. And that is on the basis of a monolith of data that we have that is sitting in the past. So it's not dynamic whatsoever. It's not nonlinear. It's just sitting there. And what it's going to give us is, and I think that this is the most important point that we need to understand, is that if we are using ChatGPT or any other large language model to generate knowledge for us, it is not going to be able to give us anything that is interesting in the future, because what it's going to do is just giving us an organization of how things that are usually coming together with other things in 2021. Right. So it might even take us back in all progresses that we may have done as a scientific community and as a social cultural community when it comes down to social cultural values and progresses that we may have made as communities and societies. So it's incredibly danger in that sense. And now I'm going to go back to wrap it up with the point that I was making. Why is it dangerous that we think or say or articulate that in a nodes network, like a machine learning networks that we use, right? Why is it dangerous to say that node A represents know what node B knows, or the information from node B, in a very simple way, of course? What does it mean? It means that we are anthropomorphizing and working under the assumption that node A understands semantics. And that is not the case, is exactly as it's not the case in large language models, because large language models do not understand semantics. They don't understand what is going on. That's why they cannot give you facts. It's because they do not have an understanding of semantics. They do understand syntax, but they don't understand semantics. So that is that is the danger that comes with us anthropomorphizing and thinking that they understand what they're doing, but they have absolutely no clue what they're doing. So large language models kind of like come as like the perfect example of why we should refrain from using the notion of representation in any machine learning context or in any computational model that we develop. There is no need, and it's not even that it's not needed, it's going to be problematic in the sense of the ways in which we now look at large language models and what they can do for us.
Indeed. So, and just to clarify, I'm assuming you're saying, or you're theorizing, that if what you propose, which is the non-representationalist framework, are you claiming that if we use such framework, an AI agent or AI model made from such a framework would understand semantics?
No.
Interesting. So in the sense that, are you saying right now we haven't got any proper framework to understand, to build an agent that can understand semantics?
Absolutely. We do not have.
Okay,
I'm
glad that you clarified that.
Exactly. Yeah. So now let's bring in the philosophy of mind framework that I'm working with, that I selected, right? So let's bring that one in. Yeah. What would be the requirement? That's why phenomenology is going to be really important, and cognitive science is going to be really important.
We're going to go there for sure.
Exactly. Yes. So now let's think about what would be the requirement for an artificial system, right, to be able to understand semantics.
I have no idea.
Right. So what would be from this framework?
Well, I can speculate. Perhaps being in the world.
Being in the world.
To use a Heideggerian term.
Absolutely, being in the world, right? So doing what? Doing the things that we've been doing, which is like from birth, being situated in a social cultural environment, right? That has meanings, that has values embedded in it, being part of these cultural practices, being part and contributing to these cultural narratives, being enculturated with these symbolic structures. Because sometimes people turn to me and they say, well, if all it takes is that an artificial system is embodied and embedded in an environment for it to be considered intelligent, somehow closer to the ways in which human beings are intelligent, then we can think about, for example, and they asked me, do you think that this would be enough, that we would have, for example, a humanoid robot that is equipped with any sort of large language model, right? Because now we have embodied and we have embeddedness, right? And I'm like, that's not it yet, right? So we need to go back to what phenomenology says, but we need to go back to what cognition says, that are the defining properties of cognition, right? So if you begin from the point of view that to use Heidegger's notion of being thrown in the world, thrownness, which is a very, very wonderful concept. You're thrown in the world, and then you don't have a choice. You have to immediately start acting upon the world, and immediately being situated and embedded in a very strong embodiment sense, not in a weak sense, with that environment, and already participating and being part of a certain specific social cultural environment, right? So that's what we are talking about. That's the level, that's the scale that we are talking about, right? So if you bring this this kind of like a philosophy of mind approach, as I am bringing, so then those would be very specific foundational requirements for any artificial intelligence system to be anywhere close to being able to have some level of sentientness or intelligence like we have. Because you need all of that interaction with the environment, not only on the phenomenological level, but also on the representational level, right? You need that interaction with the environment such that you are enculturated with these symbolic structures, such that you understand the use of concepts in the ways in which you interact with the world. And here use, I'm really taking that notion in terms of the Wittgensteinian sense of the use of linguistic practices as embedded in cultural practices.
So would this be like the language games
Absolutely.
that Wittgenstein talks about?
Absolutely.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay, Ines, because I'm cognizant of the time, I have a lot more to ask about the CP framework, but perhaps we'll pause it and we'll put that on the back burner for now, because I want to get to the other bit, which is exciting, e-cognition, embodied cognition. Now, I'll ask the question in a bit of a bipartite manner. Firstly, again, if you could just outline what is e-cognition. I know you've done this in many other podcasts before, but apologies for having to repeat yourself. But just so that the audience is oriented and attuned to what we're talking about. And then, if you could make a sudden leap after you outline e-cognition, what's its relationship, philosophically speaking, of course, to the free energy principle?
Right.
A lot.
Okay.
I know it's a lot, but
Yes.
if it's okay, I just want to let you like play around with these concepts and bring them together.
Yes, and I'm very happy to be asked to nerd about it, because that makes me really happy. So happy
Excellent. I'm glad. Yeah.
Right. So it is not an easy task to understand e-cognition, and I think that we need to be standing on a humble perspective to precisely do that. Because it is, of course, grounded in quite a few well-established approaches. They are not new approaches. They have roots, they have historical roots in philosophy of mind that does not reduce to Western analytic philosophy of mind, right? So that's why it is important, first step, to be humble about understanding the framework, and then understand that each approach is rich in itself. It's got strong roots, and although there are common claims across the board within the e-cognition approaches, there are specific focuses that each framework brings, and the focus that each framework brings is determined by the kind of or the level or scale that the framework is most developed upon, right? So that's just sort of like a prefacing the framework. So basically, we have. We can think about e-cognitive science again in a range, and I like that, because that gives us a spectrum, which is always, I think, a very safe step to take rather than binary approaches. So we can think of a distribution of e-cognitive science approaches within a range. And how are they distributed? They are distributed, again, it's like all roads in philosophy of mind will take us to representation. Or at least, let me just rephrase that and correct it: for all roads in Western analytic philosophy of mind will take us to the notion of representation. And e-cognitive science is no exception. So what we have is the ways in which I find it more intuitive to understand how they connect to each other, and how they connect as well to the other more traditional analytic philosophy of mind, which is more computational in character, is by virtue of how they understand and how far they go in being radical according to the notion of representation. So let's say that, just for the sake of of mapping the literature, let's say that computational theory of mind, which is also a very rich literature, let's say that that literature is going to tell us that the mark of the mental is mental representation. Let's say that computational theory of mind is going to tell us that cognitive life is reducible, ontologically reducible, not even just explanatory reducible, but ontologically reducible to mental representation, which means that every component and all the activities that we engage with in our cognitive life can be explained to the form of a person having a belief and acting upon that belief and updating that belief. Right. So, and then there's different computational theory of mind approaches that are going to sort of like build a theory about how these beliefs come to be and how these beliefs beliefs come to be updated. So that's, in a nutshell, computational theory of mind. And I'm so sorry to those that endorse computational theory of mind that I'm not doing a super fair...
Not doing justice, yeah.
But in the interest of time. So then this allows me now to map e-cognition in according to the more traditional computational theory of mind and analytic philosophy of mind. So then you can think of e-cognition as a range of different approaches that you can ask how radical are they, or how much do they still endorse or borrow or need or leverage from the notion of representation, which is the core aspect of computational theory of mind, right? Right, so then you can ask that, and then you have different ones. So now I'm going to just list them. So we've got embeddedness, we've got embodied or embodiment, we've got extended, we've got inactive, and there's a few more like ecological and emotive. But in the interest of time, I'm going to talk about four, and I'm going to locate them.
E cognitive science model, right? That's
absolutely.
Like
so
colloquially known, let's say.
Precisely. So the E comes from the fact that all these approaches begin with an E. So there we have e-cognitive science. And then, so then we have, let's say that here you have computational theory of mind, and then let's say that here you have the range of e-cognitive science, right? So then we can start locating them by how much do they need to use and find usefulness in the concept of representation as being quite central, right? So then we can say that embeddedness would be the one that sits closer to the computational theory of mind, because what is meant in that approach is that cognitive life takes place in an embedded way. So the system or the living being is situated in an environment, right? So that is a position that most people endorse. So that's not controversial. This sits very close to computational theory of mind. And then let's say that you have as the next stop is extended mind. So the extended mind, developed by Clark and Chalmers, what it says is that we kind of like incorporate tools as part of our cognitive life, right? And that is quite appealing, and I think it was really good to have that thought and that theory coming in '98, because it really came to ask certain very important questions and kind of like revolutionize a little bit the old school computational theory of mind, right? So in that particular case, why am I locating extended mind very close to the computational theory of mind? Well, it's because even in its most radical form, and this is quite clear from a paper from Andy Clark from 2015, which is a paper entitled Radical Predictive Processing. It is quite clear in that paper that representation is still taking a main core in this extended mind, right? So what we have a system that is comprised by brain, body, and the object that is in the environment, right? Now, this could be very well, it could be seen as being quite radical e-cognitive science. Why is it not? So it is not because the ways in which you explain this system is that it is a computational process throughout. So that's why it is a computational theory of mind still. So it is true that it brings in the notion of the body to play a causal role in cognition, as opposed to many other theories that reduce cognition to the brain. So it is true that brings the body to play a fundamental role in cognition, as well as something that is in the world, like a technological device, to also play a causal role in cognition. So that was quite revolutionary at the time. What makes it a computational theory of mind is, and close to the computational theory of mind in this range that I've just established, is that this whole process between the brain, the body, and the tool is, as explained by Andy Clark, is of the computational kind.
Meaning, just to clarify, that would mean that it's something that could run on a Turing machine. It's a computational process.
Exactly. So basically, we are explaining here cognitive aspects of life, cognitive processes as being of the computational kind that process information. So very analogous to a machine. And what kind of machine? A predictive machine.
Predictive machine.
That's it, right? So then what we have is it is a distributed system rather than saying that cognition reduces to the brain, which there are certain accounts that do that. This is also a computational process, except that it is distributed. So that's what makes extended mind sitting quite close to the computational theory of mind, and that's no secret. And the ways in which Andy Clark understands the body is in no way the ways in which Merleau-Ponty understands the body, or embodiment in e-cognitive science understands the body. Because let's say that Merleau-Ponty and embodiment, which I'm going to talk in a second, take a strong embodiment approach, whereas Andy Clark, when he talks about embodiment, and he does, embodiment is quite a fundamental concept within the extended mind, and even within radical predictive processing. But it is really important to understand that the embodiment that Andy Clark is talking about is not Merleau-Ponty embodiment, because the embodiment is the body plays a crucial role in this computational predictive process. So that's why I would locate extended mind close to computational theory of mind approaches. And then let's move on into the ones that are actually now starting to question the notion of representation as being central, as being the mark of the mental, and questioning that cognition comes down to a computational process that is analogous to computational process of any kind. Those that actually question that and reject that, we start having embodied cognitive science. So embodiment, as it is rooted in Peirce, in Merleau-Ponty, in the whole phenomenology tradition. So that's embodied cognitive science, and we have extraordinary work on that today, for example, by Sean Gallagher, who I would say that because of his most recent approaches as well as his most recent books, I would call that kind of approach the embodied inactivism. So there's that one, which is very much rooted in phenomenology. So then the focus on embodied cognitive science is going to be on the body and how the body is grounding of the experience. So the body is not in the service of the brain, as Andy Clark would have it. The body is in the service of my cognitive experience. So of the whole agent, right? So the body is what grounds the experience of the agent. So that's embodied cognitive science in a nutshell. Then we move on into inactivism. And in inactivism, we find, we can say, three different approaches, because I'm going to include a bit of work from Sean Gallagher in this embodied inactivism, right? So which is quite interesting, which is the situatedness of the body, or the core aspect of the body, as well as the body being situated in the environment. And then we have another form of inactivism, which is potentially the first one, which is the one that began with Maturana and Varela. It's very much coming from biology back in the 90s, 80s. And in there are specific concepts that are really interesting and relevant to understand cognition that they bring in at a time, and I think they are very much relevant still today, which is the notion of autopoiesis, and which is kind of like the notion of self-organization, and how they really connect all of these like systems biology approach to explain cognition in ways that is completely antagonic to computational theory of mind. So they bring in like systems biology to explain cognition in the sense of living beings as being multi-scale living beings that are both operationally closed and thermodynamically open, living in this state of precariousness. So this quite interesting literature that then has been connected by the hands of Evan Thompson, and mostly Evan Thompson has been making connections with Buddhist philosophy, which is extremely interesting and engaging, as well as the work by Ezequiel Di Paolo and Anna Diaga, who have been having this extraordinary work on bringing out certain aspects that I find extremely appealing, which is how cognition does not come down to representation, because even when we are engaging in languaging, even when we are engaging in conversations with other people, it is not just a matter of us using representational structures such as language, but there's so much more that is involved in a conversational and in an interaction that does not come down to those representational structures or symbolic structures like language, which is why they have the book Linguistic Bodies. So we are linguistic bodies rather than being like these computational machines that utter beliefs in a form of computational processes. So that's rejected, right? So that's why I'm now getting away in my range. I'm kind of getting away from the computational theory of mind. And then let me just say the last one, which is the radical inactivism. Exactly. So that's through the hands of Daniel Hutto and Eric Mean. And in there, the view is more radical, to the sense that they question and they ask a fundamental, I think, question, which is, where does content come from? And why is content relevant? Is because content is what is going to allow us to then eventually engage in these social cultural practices that have some form of semantic meaning. Right. So then, in the grand scheme of cognition and cognitive development, then the question is about how does content come to be that allows us to engage in this semantic practice, in these cultural practices that also have a semantic content, and how can we explain that content being shaped and shaping our individual experiences. So and how that and how that shaping and being shaped by is highly socioculturally situated. So that would be far out in the range.
That makes sense. Yeah.
That would be the mapping.
And those are the 4 E's, right?
We could also add the ecological psychology one, which is a whole field in itself as well, and quite prominent and vast literature.
Perfect. So Inês, and now I'm going to try to outline this here, but forgive me in fact, correct me if I do make any mistakes. So I'm trying to see how we can leap from e-cognition, or how we can step towards this idea of the free energy principle that's inspired a lot of researchers in AI and in all of neuroscience to a variety of fields, which obviously was introduced by Carl Friston. So my understanding, my very layperson's understanding, is that we have this, as you mentioned, we have this system. It could be a body, well, most likely a body. And then the free energy principle, it tries to reduce free energy. A system tries to reduce free energy in the world. And free energy is, to put it colloquially, it's uncertainty. We want to reduce uncertainty. And then there's this thing called the Markov blanket, which is a statistical, let's say, mechanism. But the Markov blanket, for, let's say, all intents and purposes, is the boundary between the world outside and then our system. So what I'm trying to understand is, from, let's say, an e-cog-sci lens, how do we make sense of the free energy principle, and then the more applicative sides of it, active inference, for instance?
Right. So thank you so much for that. Remember when I was earlier on, I was describing my understanding of a computational model, and I said that we in our most sophisticated techno-scientific practices, what we do is we develop computational models. And why would we want to do that? Well, we want to do that because we want to understand the natural world around us, right? And again, why would we specifically have to develop these computational models? Well, it's because the phenomena that we want to understand is highly complex. What does that mean? That means that I cannot set up an experimental paradigm that would allow me to study that, because there's high levels of complexity. Like, let's think that we want to understand and ideally predict future states of a black hole. So one thing I cannot do, that is not available to me, that is not afforded to me, is I cannot set up an experiment.
Indeed. In fact, something even, let's say, like the stock market. There's never been anyone who's been able to predict the stock market, right?
Why is that? Because of the high levels of complexity, of unpredictability, of high levels of uncertainty, right? So then our best chance is to develop these very sophisticated models, right? So there's got to be some touch points between the models that we develop and the world that we are trying to understand. And note that I'm not saying mirror. Note that I'm not thinking about this computational model as something that is going to give me a mirror to a phenomenon. It is a tool that is going to allow me to generate some epistemic virtue, some understanding of something that I didn't have before. By virtue of what? Of finding some reasonable way of understanding the patterns of behavior, right? So we look at what we have as patterns of behavior, and then by that, hopefully, we generate some understanding, and ideally, we would gain some predictability or predictive power, right? So that's what we want to do with a computational model, and that's the way in which I see a computational model. So you can use and develop a computational model within active inference and with active inference, but you can also do that with many other techniques, right? Whether or not active inference is going to be the best one is up to debate, right? I tend to think that it is a very good one to understand cognition because of certain features that active inference and the free energy principle bring to the table as a conceptual toolkit, as a mathematical toolkit that I find useful. And I find that is going to be specifically useful if you endorse an e-cognitive science perspective of psychological life, of cognitive life, right? So, but this is, again, it's really important to understand that this is a tool. It's a model that we are going to develop in order to understand the phenomenon, which is going to have limitations. I would not say that this model is going to allow us to understand the phenomenology of experience, because that's not what the model is supposed to do. It allows us some understanding of behavior, of cognitive behavior of living beings, and allows us, hopefully, some predictability on the future states that we may find that living being or those living beings, given the patterns of behavior that we know.
Perfect, perfect. Okay, on the note, and it's a bit of a highly, let's call it a highly speculative question, because I've been thinking if we could imagine what would an AI model built through this toolkit you put forward, which is the firstly the e-cognition, and then also the kind of active inference, and then the broader free energy principle. So what would an AI agent or a model built with that toolkit, how would that differ to, like, let's say, using deep learning, something like ChatGPT or an LLM? How can we, if we can imagine an AI agent coming from that line of thinking, or let's say that world, what would it look like?
Excellent question. Very happy to answer that one. So it would look like something quite different. So when we were talking about large language models being whatever output they give you, it's an output that is not factual. It's an output that is not intelligent. It's an output that is coming from the monolith databases that it has access to. And it's not extrapolating in the future, it's not making decisions for the future, even though it looks like, again, Chinese room, it looks like it is, but it's not giving you facts, it doesn't understand what it's doing, and it's not giving you new opportunities or creative pathways towards the future. So those are the limitations that large language models have. And that's why they are called stochastic parrots.
Yes,
right?
I love that term.
Exactly. So that's why they're called stochastic parrots. These are the limitations that they have. And even recently, the OpenAI CEO or CTO, in an interview, quite rightly so, said, for us to make any progress from here, we need another breakthrough. Because this is it, right? This is it. Of course, we can develop many apps on the basis of the large language models, and we can do lots of creative things that can help us do our most fastidious work tasks in different ways. And of course, it's having a profound impact in all levels and scales of society, including the universities, so all of the places where we generate knowledge, as well as any other societal domains. Which makes it even more important for us to understand why these systems are stochastic parrots and why we need to be careful about it. So, that being said, what would large language models, so that we have a case that we can use, look like under an active inference framework, which is something that we're actually working on. So that would look like a distributed system of intelligence, right? What this means is that it's important to maybe just first, I would just say something about active inference and the free energy principle. Is it has been developed in the last few years to understand cognition and the brain. So the ways in which, coming from where I'm coming from, which is the e-cognitive science understanding of cognitive life, active inference as a model to understand that is relevant and interesting because it gives you a coupling between a system and its environment. So it gives you a situatedness, right? So where there is some level of operational closure, right, by the Markov blanket that you mentioned, but the system must, if the system wants to remain alive, and typically they do, stressing that typically there are exceptions which are very interesting to study. So if the system wants to remain alive, it has to be permanently open in exchanging energy and matter with the environment. That's how it remains alive. So that is the subtlety that is quite important and relevant that this framework brings into the table, is that it tells you something that might look like a contradiction, which is, how is it possible that the system is both operationally closed and thermodynamically open, right? So once you do that, that's not only quite compatible with what inactivists say, right? And it's completely, from this perspective, would be completely rejecting the view that cognition is encapsulated in the brain and the brain is separated from the environment. Therefore, it needs to infer quite literally what is happening in the environment. So from this perspective, I'm rejecting computational theory of mind and saying that, well, that's not the case, actually, because you need to be thermodynamically open, constantly exchanging matter and energy with the environment. And interestingly, I'm not talking here only on the agent level, I'm talking about all levels of life. So a cell must be situated in a cell tissue such that it is operationally closed, it's got boundaries, right? And it must be thermodynamically open such that it's always exchanging matter and energy with its environment if it wants to remain alive, right? So that is quite interesting and relevant. So once you understand cognition like that, you understand cognition as systems that are permanently coupled with the environment. And when they're not, they are dead because they become closed systems, not open systems. So that is all coming from systems neuroscience, and it's quite. I think it's quite a good complement from a computationally technical perspective. It's a good complement to the more theoretical development that we do within e-cognitive science or in activism. So that's that. Now, applying all of that knowledge that we've been working on within cognitive science to artificial intelligence, things are going to look quite different to when you come from a computational perspective, right? Because when you come from a computational perspective, you may be happy to define that a humanoid robot that is equipped with a large language model is going to be sentient, is going to be intelligent, is going to be a cognitive system. You might end up to those conclusions, right? It's easy to make those steps. When you come from e-cognitive science, that doesn't come for free. It's not a commodity that a system that is just like behaving like it is intelligent is intelligence. So we will see in there a Chinese room situation, right? So then on that note, what you would want to achieve and where you want to go in the future is you want to have, we are talking about like any form of artificial intelligence that is anywhere in the realm of a natural intelligent system, then what you want to have is we want to have a system that is capable of adapting to high levels of surprise and here I'm already introducing the free energy principle, adaptable to high levels of surprise, right? That can deal with high levels of surprise, that can make decisions, real-time, real-world decisions based on the understanding of the present state of affairs. And this is very different to what a large language model can do, because a large language model is going to give you what was the likelihood of certain words or certain facts or certain things coming until, according to what we've got in our databases, until a certain point in time. So it's going to give you what happened in the past. And if you really want to have a system that is anywhere close to what we are capable to do, it needs to be able to, in the real world, in the present time, make decisions that are highly sensitive to the context around them, right? In the ways that it understands the state of affairs. And that's not a large language model.
No, totally. I mean, forgive me, I'm a bit of a romantic. Just thinking about the idea that how beautiful that is, because the one other thing with the LLMs or large language models is the immense computational power it takes to run these models.
Absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I don't know if you're familiar with Scott Aronson, the American computer scientist. I believe he's like a consultant at OpenAI. He was saying recently that OpenAI has been investing in quantum computing because they're running out of resources to fill these LLM models because they take that much energy. And with all of that, it can't even still it can't exist in the present conditions. It's still living in the past. Whereas as humans, we're totally different in the sense that we don't need one millionth of that kind of energy, but also we can live in the present world and, as you laid out, reduce uncertainty, whatever the case may be. So I just find that a beautiful idea of describing what it means to be a human being. Excellent. All right. Since we are already on the kind of the speculative terrain here, I think I want to get to more of the interesting questions that I don't know if you've been asked these questions before in podcasts, but I want to talk about psychoanalysis, and just as a philosopher of AI, and as someone with a deep understanding of in the literature of the philosophy of mind, what are your views in general, just intimations on psychoanalysis? And do you think there's anything we can gain, just at least philosophically interesting, or perhaps later on even for more technical work, from the field of psychoanalysis, from the, let's say, controversial field of psychoanalysis?
Right. So typically, I am not very drawn to psychoanalysis. Why is that? Because I do not really endorse the view of mental life or psychological life being something that is hidden and needs to be kind of like retrieved.
The idea like the unconscious, you mean?
Yes, exactly. So I am not very much, I don't really see philosophical reasons to believe that the ways in which we have access or could have access to our mental life is through introspection. So to open that a little bit more and make more relations to the literature, I am here being very Wittgensteinian. Okay, so Wittgenstein tells us in the remarks on philosophical psychology that our psychological life is right there next to us, accessible to us like any other objects in the world. We just really have to pay attention and notice that it is right there. So it is a matter of finding the possibilities of communicating that psychological life, and I'm really here. I'm kind of like trying not to use mental life, because mental might give us the notion that I want to avoid, which is something that is like quite intrinsic, quite obscure, and needs to be retrieved from the depths of something. So our psychological life is something that is accessible to us. Quite accessible is right there because that's what we are made of. That's what we are, is that psychological life. And what kind of psychological life? Well, it's one would say, and here it connects a little bit with Sean Gallagher's work on the self as patterns, right? It's the view that my psychological life is the conjunction of all my past experiences together with this particular moment in time where I'm having this interaction, right? So that is right here, right now, because that's what I am. Right, so it connects a little bit with the self as patterns of experiences that one has had that brought me here today, right in front of you, right? So it's right here. Whatever it is that I'm saying, whatever it is that I'm doing is a result of precisely that psychological experiences that I've been having. So there's nothing hidden. There is nothing that needs to be retrieved through introspection. If there is anything hidden, and this is the subtle, very important point in Wittgenstein's remarks of philosophy of psychology, if there's anything that is hidden, it's hidden to other people.
Fascinating.
So
if you could elaborate on that, that's fascinating.
Here is where the beetle comes in. So it refers to our psychological life as if like each one of us had a box with a beetle inside. Right.
Okay. Yeah.
And I can see my beetle.
Yeah.
I have total access to my beetle. Of course, the more and more you are intentionally wanting to, get to know yourself, who you are, in the ways in you behave and you interact, you can pay attention to see who you really are, right? The more committed you are with it, of course, the better you're going to have a grasp on your identity. What is hidden is that you don't have access to another person's beetle.
Okay.
That's what's hidden, right? And the only possibility that we have to have access to each other is through language. And that's through our language games, which is where it comes from. There is no such thing as a private language because we co-construct. We are co-responsible for the language games that we engage with and construct together. So the mental or the psychological life is nothing that is really hidden. It just needs to be said through the language game. It needs to be communicated. But I am here with all that I'm made of, that is my psychological life, that is right here accessible to me. Now, we can engage in practices that are going to allow us to have a much clearer grasp of what is meaningful to us and who we are and our individualities and identities, right? We can take more control, we can take more charge, we can be more intentional in clarifying that, right, for ourselves. And one tool that allows us to do that is through language, is the ways in which we are going to communicate those aspects of us with other people, right, or even with us. By means of using language games. Those are our best bets to precisely do that.
Interesting. Well, what if, Inês, to play a bit of devil's advocate, let's say a person who's more of a defender of psychoanalysis would say, in some sense, a psychoanalyst would be working with a client or an analysand, and they'd be on the therapy couch or whatever Freud used. I don't think they use a couch anymore. I'm not sure. I've never been with a therapy before. So, and the idea is through language, they're trying to help the person build more clarity into their subjectivity or beinghood or whatever you may call it. And would you still say that there's some value in this idea that, yes, the truth of who we are isn't deep down somewhere in the unconscious, but rather it's out there. The truth is out there. But still, for us to make this truth more meaningful, we need some kind of, and language perhaps is the best tool for this. We need another agent, another party to clarify that for us. Absolutely.
So the means by which it is done, let's say that it's a talk therapy, right? Talk therapy. It's quite relevant, and there would be one way in which that helps us notice the most relevant aspects that are most defining of our identities, right? So it doesn't mean that we need to go to therapy because we are struggling with a general mental health condition such as anxiety, depression, or PTSD, or whatever, right? That's relevant and that's useful even for someone that is not struggling with any general mental health condition, because what we get somebody that is helping us navigate and look and identify the aspects that are most relevant as defining features of we are, right? So in a way, it's important to have those elements in our life that are going to bring us out of our habitual perspective and help us have a different, more outside, more forest kind of like perspective to look at ourselves and identify the aspects that are meaningful to us and relevant in the definition of our identities. And there are many ways in which that can be done. One of them is talk therapy, but there are many other ways in which that can be done. In this particular case, Wittgenstein would have it that a good therapy session is a session in which the therapist helps us identify aspects of the ways in which we perceive the world that would otherwise go unnoticed, that we don't see that those are the meaningful aspects. So in the Tractatus, he says, the limits of my language are the limits of my world. That's what he says in the Tractatus. And I think that we could say that in later Wittgenstein, the Remarks of Philosophy of Psychology, is the limits of my perspective upon the world are the limits of my world. What does this mean? This means that you cannot see the world as the world is. You can only see the world as you are. So then therapy is going to be about who am I? Let's find those aspects that are defining, that allow me to see the world in a certain way that another person does not see in that way, because the other person didn't have the kind of like psychological experience that I've had until now. Right? So it's identifying those aspects that make a certain object being perceived by me with such and such and such and such features, rather than other features. That would be the features that would appear to someone else.
Perfect. That makes a lot more sense. Yeah, I mean, I think I certainly, in many ways, share your critique, especially why I find a lot of people get into like union depth psychology. And I find that quite problematic, because it does again assume that there's like this unconscious that only your therapist can realize about yourself. But the way you outlined it, it makes more sense to me to broaden your perspective, let's say, or to build clarity into what you already know through the medium of language. Excellent. The other thinker, Inês, is, and I'm so glad you mentioned Simone de Beauvoir in a lot of your public talks, because I know I'm an expert on her work, but most people, just like lay people like myself, we know of her as being perhaps the most important feminist philosopher of the 20th century, right? But of course, apart from being a great social and political theorist, she was a fantastic phenomenologist, and she was heavily influenced by Jean-Paul Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty and all of them. So just in general, again, because you're working in the realm of AI, how has existentialism influenced your thinking, and more specifically the work of Simone de Beauvoir?
Yes, right. Because it would seem like, why would I bringing Simone de Beauvoir to do something here? I found the more I got into artificial intelligence, coming from my background is philosophy of mind, and cognitive science and computational neuroscience. So the more I got into artificial intelligence, the more I felt the need to understand the position of artificial intelligence in our social cultural environment through the philosophy of Simone de Beauvoir. So more specifically through a framework in Ethics of Ambiguity.
Excellent book.
Excellent book. And why did I find it extremely relevant? Because it helped me understand and position artificial intelligence systems and understand how they shape and are shaped by what we do in our social cultural practices, right? How they affect our cultural communities differently, how they affect individuals within a community that has a power structure by definition differently. So I found enlightenment on Simone de Beauvoir to understand the effects of artificial intelligence systems in communities, in social cultural communities. Why? Well, through the ways in which she understands. So for starters, of course, she has got a very strong notion of embodiment that I find it's quite relevant to understand how artificial intelligence systems are going to affect people differently depending on the body that they have and how that body is situated in a power dynamics, social cultural setting. So that's quite relevant initial point. And then I find that the toolbox is useful because it allows us to understand a feedback loop. It allows us to understand that our social cultural practices within a community that have certain values and certain power dynamics are going to be nurturing of certain artificial intelligence systems to be developed rather than others. They are going to serve certain people rather than others. They are going to be harmful to certain people rather than others. So whatever we are doing in developing these artificial intelligence systems is already very telling of the values that we endorse as a community.
Indeed, and perhaps this is worth mentioning here. There is no neutral system.
There's
As
no
in,
neutral system.
the bias of our society is going to be reflected on the system itself, right?
Absolutely.
And that's very important to keep in mind.
Absolutely. And in a parallel, I would say that it's paralleling with the ways in which we've been doing science. So here I'm just making a connection with feminist epistemology and feminist philosophy of science, the ways in which we've been doing science for many, many, many years, where there's been no diversity in the ways in which we do science and in the ways in which we claim to have a scientific model of something, but that scientific model is an output of a very highly dominant group of people. And this connects with standpoint theory as well, in which what we have come to learn more recently as science has become more diverse, as we have had more perspectives in science and scientific practices that are not coming from the West. And it's worth acknowledging that the West is only representative of 19% of the population. So as the more we've been having and listening carefully about science practices and science work that has been coming from more diverse groups, the more diversity we've been having in science in general. And interestingly, the more we've been able to understand that many well-established paradigms and many textbook phenomena that we thought we understood, especially in psychology, in cognitive psychology, are now being questioned, with many problems arising, like the replication crisis, for example, or the weird problem in cognitive psychology as well. So I think that what we have in artificial intelligence is a problem that is analogous to the kind of like scientific practices that we had. What is the problem? Is that if you have a techno-scientific community that is not diverse, then what is going to emerge, like the resources that are going to be used, the problems that are going to come up as worth a solution, as worth the funds to be developed, are going to be those that interest or are in the interest of that dominant group.
Indeed.
So that's one part of it. So there's no such thing as neutral AI. So the AI, the ways in which we are already thinking about a problem that needs to be solved, the ways in which we design the solution, the ways in which we develop the software, the ways in which we implement it, is already profoundly social. It's profoundly social. So then I think that this allows us to understand the feedback loop in which AI systems emerge from already a very situated social cultural environment that has very specifics that are going to be there, which is why then we can talk about the algorithmic biases and data biases and all of that kind of thing. So that's the status, I think, in which we should look and think about AI systems if we are to have any hope on regulation and thinking about it ethical AI, if there's any hope to think about it like that. And then there's the other side of the feedback loop, which is how, now that we have already a system that is an AI system out there in the wild, in the society, how that is going to affect different people in the power dynamics within a social cultural environment. And here is where I found that Simone de Beauvoir, now to come back to Simone de Beauvoir, here's where I find that Simone de Beauvoir has got a nice toolkit. It's kind of like, we can think about it as what we call an AI dilemma. So the AI dilemma is that it comes up with the promises that it's going to make life easier for our human species survival as a whole. the promise is that, like any other tool that civilization has been developing, in any other form of niche construction, the idea is that life is going to be easier because we have these tools available to us, right?
Sort of utopian dream.
Absolutely, and then we can defy the second law of thermodynamics. We can defy like all of the constraints coming from the natural world. We can overcome all of that, and life is going to be much easier for all of us. But why is there a dilemma? The dilemma is that that's the promise, right? The dilemma is that with many tools, and there's a very rich literature and philosophy of technology, from Heidegger to many other approaches, and thinking about the role of technology in societies and in communities. AI is no less of that. So AI is the same kind of situation where an AI system is going to affect people differently. So the Simone de Beauvoir toolkit that I find interesting to think about it is that Simone de Beauvoir talks about our experience, our individual experience, as situated within a social cultural power dynamics, is a continuous negotiation between freedom and facticity, between agency and objectification. So that, I think, really helps us here to see our situation in a social cultural environment that is employing AI that goes unregulated, right? Because it comes with the promise of freedom. It comes with the promise that we're going to be much freer because we're going to be much more empowered as a species to live lives more conveniently. Let's put it like that. So it's the promise of freedom. It's going to free us from our biological, social, cultural constraints, right? But the thing is, it's not going to free everyone.
Yeah, and the question is, free whom? And what kind of freedom?
Yeah, so then we find ourselves in that particular situation that Simone de Beauvoir described as a continuous negotiation between freedom and facticity. So nothing really changed. Right, we are going to continue this continuous negotiation between agency and objectification, where you're going to have certain groups of social cultural communities that are going to be harmed, and you have a certain elite that is going to profit or benefit from those advancements of those technologies. So I think that needs to be brought to the foreground if we are to have any hope of talking about ethical AI.
Yeah, in fact, people talk about a lot of things like AI alignment and whatnot, but I find that this kind of game theoretic way of viewing AI alignment, it always misses out on those more subtler and, in my view, the more important points: embeddedness, the fact that us situatedness, and then the fact that we're a part of this socio-symbolic world, and that's fascinating. I loved how you weaved in the embeddedness idea from the more technical work into kind of the more political works of Simone de Beauvoir. That's beautiful. Yeah. In fact, Inês, have you got any papers where you explore these ideas you laid out? Because I couldn't really find them publicly. I can leave them in the description down below.
There's one. There is a very, very short one. There is a commentary on Susan Schneider's book Artificial You, and it's just out on Philosophy of East and West.
Excellent. I'll email you, and then I'll find the paper, and I'll leave it in the description down below.
Please do.
Excellent.
And then I'm working on a paper that is going to be out soon in a book. And this is with a colleague of mine, Paul Podolsky, and that's where we go a little bit more into political philosophy and thinking about all of these that I just laid out, but then thinking about from a critical theory perspective, going much more focusing on how different groups of people within a social cultural community are going to be affected by artificial intelligence systems. And that's a paper that is going to be out soon, and I will preprint it soon, so then I can also send that to
Excellent.
you.
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you, Inês. Okay, I want to ask you this one last question, although I'm not sure how you'll react to it. Are you familiar with the philosopher Slavoj Žižek? I know he's an interesting figure.
Not recently. I've read his work many years ago, so I'm not so sure.
Okay, so he has this interesting take. So he wrote a book called Hegel and a Wired Brain. It's a fascinating book on just Neuralink and the idea of a lot of the things that you explore. But he's highly speculative because he's an Hegelian. But I'm wondering if I show you a video by him where he kind of has this critique of AI, what your thoughts would be. So is it okay if I just show you something by
Absolutely,
him?
yes,
Yeah.
please.
He's asked this question about AI, and I'll play it here. And then I'm just curious to hear what your thoughts are on what he says.
Hello. How do I say this? I partly apologize because this isn't something that has been actually in discussion during this event, but during the sort of summary at the beginning, part of the discussion points were the future of AI.
Artificial intelligence, you mean? Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm sorry.
What are your thoughts particularly on cases of AI such as large neural networks and large language models, specifically such as Google's Lambda AI that have been claiming sentience within themselves? And ultimately, is your thoughts on the future of AI something that artificial sentience could eventually be something that could come into fruition?
It's difficult for me to give you a precise answer because, again, this is minimally a topic for another long talk, so I can only give you, a very general answer. I don't like this game of, I'm not accusing you of it, but generally in the debates on AI. You know, it's all about, we people are obviously limited. Will artificial intelligence become more intelligent than we are, and so on? To be as brief as possible, I don't see the problem of artificial intelligence in its being more bright than we, but in not being stupid in the way we humans can be. What I think is unique for us humans is to be stupid in a proper way, so that you make something or say something stupid, but then you get the message through this very stupidity, another dimension opens up to you. So I would rather say that, of course, we have now already computers which are self-learning, change, adapt to rules, but they still take mistakes as something to be overcome. They don't see the, let's call it the productivity, the capacity to open up a new space of the mistake as such. To make it a little bit clearer, what I mean, in my book on Hegel and the wired brain, I use these examples. It's a disgusting movie. I hate the actors, everybody, but you saw, I'm afraid to mention it, 4 weddings at the funeral. You know, but nonetheless, you know that scene when Hugh Grant declares love to Andy McDowell, I think, and in his own fake way, he gets confused, stutters, blah, blah, blah. But in this way, he succeeds in declaring love. If he were to say it clearly how he loves her, it would be a fake. So you see how the mistake as such renders the message. Now I enter a very complex domain of what John Elster, a pretty good Norwegian theorist of rational action, calls states which are necessarily byproducts. For example, I wrote about this in a text that was published in one of your philosophical monthly journals, Philosophy Now or what. If I say I have dignity, it's self-defeating. Because if I say this, it's ridiculous. I must display dignity through the way I act. And the same goes for many of our acts, which you cannot, it is self-defeating if you directly talk about them. At this level, I try to circumscribe something that maybe, at least the way things stand now, artificial intelligence, I think, cannot do. Again, I repeat, not because we humans are brighter, but because we humans learned to use in a productive way our stupidity, our limitation itself. But I'm sorry, maybe now it would be too much to go into this.
Not sure if any of them made sense, but what are your thoughts, Inês?
Wow. So quite interesting perspective that that it brings in. For sure, I agree that artificial intelligence systems are not the kind of natural intelligence that we would think about when we think about human beings or even non-human animals' cognition. Interesting that it brings in stupidity. Indeed, it is part of our practices, and I think that's the concept that here I would focus more. I would bring more the difference of the ways in which you have artificial intelligence systems and you have natural intelligence. Let's call it like that. They differ in the ways that natural intelligence systems, they engage in practices, they're highly situated with the world that allow for certain kinds of mistakes to occur as well and learning from the mistakes because we are dealing with a highly uncertain world and trying to adjust, continuously adjusting to this highly uncertain world. And for some more less complex systems, like non-human animals or plant cognition, those worlds can be uncertain from the very natural sense of the environment that is uncertain, so the uncertainty comes from that. In our specific case, because we somehow developed this sophisticated form of intelligence that separates us apart from non-human cognition, which is like the capacity in which we have developed a whole civilization with all of these institutions and organizations that we have built, that means that comes from highly sophisticated practices that we engage with, and we've been able to navigate the uncertainties of the environment in quite refined ways, which include social cultural practices within all of these power dynamics, etc., etc. So in a way, I think that I would say that we can be very stupid, but we are also highly sophisticated in the ways that we were able to build all of these institutions for us and around us. So I would say that it is on our practices that resides that difference.
Yeah, and I think it connects a lot again to what we discussed about, Simone de Beauvoir and
Absolutely.
the idea of embeddedness is fascinating. Yeah, thank you for humoring me with that because it's Zizek I find him fascinating. I love reading his books, but of course, to get to what he's saying, it takes a bit of, it takes, I'd say, being a part of his language game to see where he's coming from. Fascinating.
Yes.
All right, Inês, one last question and a completely personal question because I do need your advice here. As we discussed before the podcast, I am in many ways trying to follow in your footsteps. So what advice would you have for any person who wants to go into the research and philosophy of AI specifically? What are the big topics right now in the contemporary philosophy of AI research that needs thinking, that needs to be addressed in your view?
So there are a couple, of course. I think that, and now I'm just going to speak to, of course, there's a reason why I've defined this as my field of research for the next couple of years, is that I really think that we need a very serious understanding or description of how of the role that AI plays in our social cultural settings, right? Because this is going to connect with everything else and all of the societal problems that we are facing. I think that, I've always been very motivated to do my philosophy work very connected and close to the real world, right? So I think that there are a few very important questions that remain from many years ago in many different philosophy approaches within specifically cognitive science or philosophy of mind, which is my field, that still remain, and we need to tackle them and continue to develop literature and develop theory on that. But I also think that I like to do that in connection with the real world, aware of the real world, speaking to the real world. And I think that in the case of AI, there is an objective necessity to do that, because AI is in a way, it is a new aspect of our enculturation and the ways in which we experience the world. It has been made more prominent with the advent of large language models. But I want to stress that AI has been around making decisions for you and I about who gets the job, what treatment do you get when you get sick. AI has been around making all of these decisions for us for a long time. It's just that we were not very aware of it. So this is a real momentum and opportunity for us to think about, develop understanding and descriptions about what role is AI playing in our social cultural environments. Where does it come from, these AIs that we are creating, and how are they impacting different people sitting in different structures of the power dynamics?
As we discussed.
So I find this a very important topic of research that we do not have clarity on, either because one would take the computational theory of mind and think that, okay, so if it is the case that mind is a computer of the predictive computational capacity, then perhaps it would be the case. It's very simple to do this argument jump into thinking that, well, if large language models are also predictive computers or predictive computations, then they may at some point, sometime in the future, become conscious. And I'm going to push back on that, right? Because I think that's distracting, right? Because while we are distracted on those very
esoteric,
philosophical, esoteric confusions, as Wittgenstein would have it, then we are not doing anything that will actually bring some epistemic value and gain that would allow now our best legislators, our best ethicists to come in with a fully clear description of the role that AI is playing and how it impacts different people. So then with that clarity, then we can have our ethicists coming in and helping legislate these systems. Otherwise, they will go unlegislated because the governmental institutions, they do not have the capacity. Without this clarity, there is no capacity to understand the technology. So you would not be able to legislate the technology itself. And then without this clarity of how the technology is going to impact people, then you will not be able to legislate that impact. So that's why I think that these, so to speak, cognitive science of artificial intelligence that takes into highest consideration enculturation and enculturated aspects of social cultural power dynamics is really important to connect to the real world, where we really need to legislate the impact of these systems into people.
Yeah. All right, I think that ethical call to action is the perfect place for us to conclude. Thank you for your time, Inês.
Thank you so much for having me. Really, really, what a wonderful time. Thank you.
Excellent. It was a great chat. Thank you.
Thank you.